It's August 25th, 2025. Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com, a free site. Bettingangle.us, a free site. Always1776.com, a free site. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Folks, truth be told, I'd rather be making sports videos here online. But Dr. King, um, a personal hero of mine, talked about how when things start going south, when society crosses certain lines, good people need to stand up and be heard. So I'm just trying to be heard. I really want to encourage people who believe in free markets, who actually have power, not someone like me who's just a YouTuber. I really want to encourage them to stand up and say enough and have some resistance to what I'm about to discuss, right? We need to get our ship back in the right harbor. This idea of the U.S. government buying 10% of Intel is one of the worst ideas that I've ever encountered. Right? I don't want the government buying parts of companies. Right? I understand Intel, is a fine company. They're trying to make a profit, but I want there to be really a great wall between the U.S. government and ownership of private businesses. Right? Our government should not be picking winners and losers. I understand there's a narrative out there that talks about the importance of semiconductors and things like that. The way to address that is to lower taxes for every player in the space. It's not to pick a player, worse yet, fund it through the CHIP Act, and then say we're entitled to 10% equity ownership and profits going forward. Right? I don't want the American taxpayer to be in a position where suddenly there's an incentive to make laws that favor Intel at the expense of more efficient companies in the space. Right? We should not have an ownership position in Intel. Right? Quite frankly, I personally don't believe we should be lending money to Intel. Right? If you want to help semiconductors manufacturers, pass laws that help everyone who manufactures semiconductors. Then ask yourself the hard question as to why those laws shouldn't apply to everyone else in the economy. Let me also rant about this absolutely absurd and ridiculous profit sharing arrangement that we've reached with NVDA, for example, to sell chips to China. Right? On the one hand, we're hearing that allowing high end chips to be sold to China poses a national security risk. Right? Understand the money we spend to offset that risk. Right? We're, supporting our military. Right? No doubt we have intelligence assets all over the place. We have an intelligence infrastructure. Right? We're defending ourselves by spending money. We have soldiers placing their lives at risk. Right? We're developing, tanks and drones and you name it. Weapons for war. Supposedly to offset this risk. But yet, apparently, if you're a well-placed company like NVIDIA, AMD, apparently you can just say to the government, hey, I'll tell you what, we'll give you a percentage of the profits we get from selling high-end chips to China. Folks, it makes no sense. I don't like it. This trade barrier tariff talk has really jumped the fence. It's getting worse by the day. If selling high-end chips to China is a national security risk, then there should not be any side deals with individual market players to do just that. If there's no national security risk, then American semiconductor manufacturers should be able to sell high-end chips to China. Right? What shouldn't happen, again, is a situation where the United States, because of a side deal with one individual company, sets up a legal regime where they then have an incentive to favor that company because that company is their partner in overseas trade. Right? Capitalism is really based on the idea that anyone in the space can gain market share by marketing better products. I don't want there to be two sets of rules. One for company A that's creating high-end semiconductors but isn't allowed to sell to China because of national security concerns. And company B that has the side deal with our government. And that, because of that side deal, they're allowed to create national security concerns by selling high-end chips to China. Or at least they're allowed to pass part of that cost on to the American taxpayer. Right? All they have to do is pay government 15%. We'll look the other way. Right, folks? Can you imagine if we had a policy this silly during World War II? Could you imagine a couple of companies having the right to, do trade with Nazi Germany? Not to say that China is Nazi Germany. But that's the narrative we're hearing, right? They're our big enemy. They're the ones that warrant tariffs, right? Which I don't buy as it is, right? I don't believe in tariffs. As I've said in other videos, you're the person paying the tariffs. Right? It's a consumer tax. So let's think this through. Donald Trump, I'll say he is a whirlwind. Right? There's some things he's doing I like. But I prefer capitalism. I don't want to trust his judgment on spending taxpayer money buying portions of businesses. In the comment section of this video, somebody tell me how that's not fascism. Right? And understand, I'm not someone who throws the F word around that much. Right? I'd like to see tariffs rolled back. I'd like to see these deals where suddenly we own 10% of a semiconductor manufacturer, right? Because it's in the national interest. Talk about a phrase being overused, right? Suddenly we have side deals with companies like NVIDIA where they get to trade in China, not your semiconductor business, but NVIDIA. They get to trade. There's no national security risk there as long as they pay the U.S. government 15%. I want the private sector to be independent, to the maximum extent possible from the public sector, right? I want the market to decide prices. I'm not sure if it's a better deal for the United States. If before I was paying 3 to 5% as a tariff, and now I'm paying 15% for a tariff because abroad, some other country was gouging their own consumers under the old regime, right? Their consumers were paying 30, 40, 50% tariffs on American goods exported, and I'm supposed to care that now they're only paying 15%. Right, folks? Are you sure you're better off paying a higher tariff just so the other country can figure out that they shouldn't be gouging their own citizens? Let me say, too, I'm bummed really by this muted response. Right, first, where are the people in Trump's own party to say, no, player, this isn't who we are. We believe in free markets. Right? How should things be allocated? Supply and demand. Let's get government out of the way of these transactions. If it's safe for NVIDIA to send high-end chips to China, then what are we doing playing the role of mafia, saying, hey, we'll allow the transactions to take place if you give us some money? And then, of course, if other semiconductor companies say, hey, give us the same deal, we're going to say to them, no, we're not, because we have this deal with NVIDIA. Right, folks? It doesn't work. Right? Also, we have a 2028 presidential election coming up. We already know that certain people are thinking about running for president. Right? Where is the opposition party here? Why are they not stepping forward and saying, why should we have a side deal with NVIDIA here? If it's safe to give China high-end semiconductors, then everyone in the space should have the opportunity to do so. Let the market decide what the profit margins are. Where's the opposition party stepping forward and saying, hey, I'm sure Intel is a important company. They're not more important than Meta, than Google, than, other Mag 7 companies. Why should we be owning any of Intel? Right? And if Intel is having problems competing, right, then, shouldn't we allow the market to take care of that? If Intel's having problems competing because they're nefarious players in the market, don't we have anti-monopoly, antitrust rules to address that? Right? Why should we be an Intel shareholder? Isn't that too dangerous a precedent? Right? Donald Trump, whatever happens, is only going to be the president until 2028. Right? 2 terms, and then that's it. Once you set up bad precedents, you don't know the twists and turns it's going to take when you have a new administration. Suddenly you have this incredibly bad precedent set of the government owning parts of private companies. Pretty soon you're going to hear that everything is in the national interest. Right? Housing, food, blah, blah, blah. Folks, let's not go down that road. I'm calling on the powers that be right now to rein in an administration that, quite frankly, is out of control. Right? Let me close by saying this. Look, I appreciate efforts to fight crime, but I also believe in city rights and state rights. Right? I don't like the idea of the federal government jumping the fence and suddenly the National Guard is walking the streets of D.C. and the president now is calling out Chicago and Baltimore. Folks, I'm sorry, the last I checked, D.C. has its own police force. Right? Chicago and Baltimore have their own police forces. Right? These states have their own law enforcement groups. These states